You know what? I'm not a failure because this was never possible. Actually, I was doing my best. I am doing my best. And here's what I really want to do. And here's how I want to order my life based on what matters most to me.
You're listening to Mic'd Up with RPM, an RPM Living podcast.
Welcome, everybody, to Mic'd Up with RPM. I'm Tony Souza, the VP of Marketing Relations, and we got an exciting topic for you today. We're going to jump right into one of the hottest topics in the marketplace today, and we have two really great guests, experts in this space. It's going to be a great podcast today, so stick around. I want to introduce you right away to our guests. Our first guest is Dr. Bryan Sagray. He's a performance coach and founding entrepreneur of his coaching business. He's a retired surgeon, he's an athlete and a former CEO, and extensive experience in overcoming these challenges as well. Bryan does an incredible job of engaging on LinkedIn, so be sure to connect with him there and engage with his content there. Bryan, welcome.
Hey, how are you doing?
To the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me. Excited to share with your audience and just kind of dive right in.
Awesome. All right, our next guest is Cara Houser, and she is a burnout and transitions coach, speaker, and of course, author. She's authored the book Burnout to Lit Up, Ditch the Grind and Reclaim Your Life, a guidebook for burnout recovery. She helps burned out women get their mojo back and chart a new course and build a life and career that lights them up. I love that. Absolutely. Cara, welcome to the show.
Hello, Tony. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for being here. We're going to jump right in. And I'd love for both of you, you have extensive experience both as professionals, but also working with clients. But I think what people may be very curious about is sort of how did you fall into this topic of burnout? And so with that, Bryan, I'll start with you there. Just talk to us a little bit about some of your background and kind of what led you to have a passion to help clients and others deal with really a very relevant and challenging topic today of burnout.
Yeah, I think for me, it was, as you mentioned, as a retired surgeon and then as an athlete, burnout was something that I thought was just like a normal sort of way of life, right? That it would just sort of ebb and flow, that you would have these really high highs and these really low lows, and that was just normal. Of course, looking back now, it's much easier to see that that's not the way that it's supposed to be and that it doesn't have to be that way. And so for me, it was just the old tried and true, lived it, been there, and really, really struggled. And then when I stepped into the residency director and the fellowship director before I retired from surgery, then I was on the other side of the coin. And all of a sudden now I'm seeing all these young medical students and these residents and these fellows struggling with the same thing that I went through. And it was really hard to watch because I remembered thinking, the hardest part for me was the isolation and how lonely you feel during that time. Even if you're surrounded by a lot of people, it can feel very isolating. And then, as I continued to transition through different stages of my career in different industries, it was just something that never really left me. And it's something that I knew if I went down this road, I would just always have to address and just help people navigate any way that I can, because I just really know how, demoralizing and how isolating it can be.
Cara, we'd love to hear your story of how you made it up and through in the professional world, but your exposure to burnout, even for yourself as a professional.
Yep, like Bryan, I learned about it the hard way. I spent 15 years initially anyway, in the meat grinder field of real estate development in the Bay Area, and working my little fingers to the bone and raising kids and managing a household and doing, all of those things. And like a lot of people, just kind of like Bryan was saying too, I thought, oh, well, this is just how it is. I have to do all this stuff. And if somehow I'm not perfect at it, there is some kind of personal failing in me. And I thought I had to be, for years, I just tried to be everything to everyone except myself, and put my own really needs and not just desires, but actual requirements for life at the bottom of my to-do list for so long that I just got so depleted, and my stress set point became so high that a crash was inevitable. And so but for me, and like for a lot of people, you just kind of keep cranking along at this level, thinking you have no choice, until something like a family health emergency happened. And that was my wake up call that a significant change needed to happen.
Yeah, well, I was gonna ask that question, and I think you led right into it. And if you're willing to unpack it a little bit more, you and Bryan both mentioned, when you experience this, you just think this is life. This is what it's supposed to be, especially as a high level professional. I'll just stay here, Cara, with you. When did, and feel free to share the extent of the details that you want or you don't want to. But when did you sort of draw that correlation that I don't think this is what it's supposed to be?
Hmm. Mine started like 10 years ago too, and so it
Mm.
was definitely in a time where you didn't think to say, and in my field where everybody's pretty macho, like I was taking this stress management class, and I was too afraid to even admit that because I
Well,
thought, oh well, they'll
mhm.
just think I'm a wimp. I can't take that
Soft or
pressure.
right, right, right.
But for me, we were actually kind of on a fun weekend away in the snow.
Hmm.
My son has a severe nut allergy,
Mm.
and so there's always sort of a little bit of a level of vigilance there. He was 5 at the time.
Sure.
And I'm just sitting there making dinner, kind of looking at the kids. I'm sure thinking about work stuff. You know what it's like when you're so
Right.
there's a billion things happening at the same time, but you're so fried, you're not thinking that clearly. And there were these other random people coming for the dinner who I didn't know, and I didn't right away go to them and talk to them about what they had brought for dessert. And before I knew it, at the end of the dinner, the kids grabbed the dessert and ran off and ate it. And my son had eaten these walnut filled brownies.
Oh, wow.
And, this is in the snow, it's rural, it's the middle of a blizzard. And he starts to have an anaphylactic reaction. And I just freaked out. I mean, really, like,
Yeah.
we had the EpiPen and we did what we needed to do, but you still have to go to the hospital. It doesn't just go away. And calling for an ambulance and waiting in the blizzard for all of that was
Wow.
just, and I basically just had like kind of a meltdown.
Right.
And the next day woke up just it was it was horrible because not only was I so stressed and in so much fear still and all that adrenaline trying to make its way out, I felt so horrible and like such a failure and like
Mm.
all the guilt and shame, like what parent would allow this to happen? And
Mm.
all of that horrible self-judgment. It was, as I call it in my book, an emotional hell cocktail.
Mm.
And my friend at the time was like, I think a sabbatical might be a good idea for you.
Bryan, I'll ask kind of the same question to you. I mean, when did you realize that this probably isn't normal or healthy?
Yeah, I think it was, we may have talked about this a little bit before, but for me, it was the same thing. It was experiencing a loss in my family when my dad passed away.
Yeah.
Basically, I was still practicing, at the time, and it's always a perfect storm, right? So it's like I was on call. We took call for a week at a time, multiple hospitals. I do an average of anywhere between 35 to 40 surgeries in a week during that time period, and that's with normal hours during the daytime of seeing patients in clinic and running to the emergency room and admitting patients and teaching class as a professor, and right, and I was married, right, and I'm trying to do normal life like
Right.
pick up groceries and grab the dry cleaning.
Right.
So you're working 100 plus hours a week every week for decades at a time, and then you throw into the mix, your dad is passing away from his second round of cancer, and basically
Mm.
I knew that my life was too much gas and no break when by the time I literally was in a place where I could literally leave. I was in DC at the time, and I could literally leave Georgetown and go home. By the time I got there, my dad had already been intubated. He was on life support, and I didn't get to say goodbye, which it's bittersweet, but at the same time, our relationship was so close, and I was so fortunate growing up to have just an incredible mom and dad that it wasn't like there was anything that was left unsaid to begin with. But it just goes to illustrate that to be so busy that by the time you wrap up your week and get on an airplane and get home, your dad is to a point to where he's on life support. I knew right then, like something has to change. It can't continue down that path.
Yeah. I mean, both those stories, I think a lot of people listening are able to relate quite a bit. Obviously, not with precise details, but I think in their own life, they have a lot going on. You both touch on a lot of similar themes. For those listening that maybe are reflecting on some of your life experiences and probably reflecting on their own current situation, I'd love for both of you to be able to sort of touch on, um, for individuals listening, what do they need to be aware of? What are some symptoms? What are some things in their own life that may be happening now that either they're conscious of or subconscious of? And I think from your experience in training, working with your clients, I think this would be really helpful for those listening to say, listen, if this stuff is happening to you, you need to be aware of it. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to kind of head it off at the pass. But Cara, I'll start with you. Just, for those listening that may resonate with some of the stories they just heard, obviously probably experiencing some of their own, what would you recommend sort of the self-assessment for them in this moment?
It's funny because the first thing is something that's so hidden in us, we don't even really notice it happening. We are raised in this very hustle culture soup of American work culture where we're all fed this, nonsense about work-life balance and how if we just are a little more efficient, we can do it all. And so I think step one is actually ditching this BS notion that you can do these two full-time jobs, paid and domestic realm, perfectly and in the time of one, and somehow still maintain yourself. And when we let that go, that actually, it releases quite a significant amount of psychic weight off our shoulders that then we can say, okay, you know what? I'm not a failure because this was never possible. Actually, I was doing my best. I am doing my best. And here's what I really want to do. And here's how I want to order my life based on what matters most to me. So the symptoms are kind of related to that. They have to do with feeling very misaligned with yourself, just feeling not right, either unwell physically, really out of touch with yourself. One sort of surprising thing that I often talk about with people is completely losing touch with what you enjoy and find fun. What you think is relaxing. I remember people used to ask me what I did for fun, and I would just think, what a horribly dumb question. It's just stupid. I don't even have time to sleep, and I definitely don't have time for anything frivolous like that. And looking back, of course, I know what a heartbreakingly important question that is to be able to answer, because if you can answer it well, that means you're in touch with yourself. You actually know who you are. You know what you like, and you're able to give those things to yourself. You're able to do your exercise, your creative stuff, whatever it is. And then when you do that, of course, you're able to show up so much better for everyone else.
Those are some great takeaways for sure. Bryan, obviously being an athlete, listening to your body is key. Any helpful feedback to those listening to be aware of some of the signals that either you were aware of or not, but ultimately how they can be more aware of them, and any suggestions you talk to your clients about today?
Yeah, I think for me, it's usually a combination of a lot of the stuff that Cara said, but it's sort of this, this four pillars, if you will, or these four categories. I usually see people with physical, behavioral, cognitive, and emotional sort of symptoms, right? And signs really is what they're seeing. And the tragic thing about that is that what they're seeing, these symptoms or these signs, right, is never really the root cause or the true problem of where this is stemming from. And that's what can be really heartbreaking, is because sometimes they'll become aware of those and they'll try to attack those, and that'll give them some relief or maybe buy them a little bit more time, but it's never going to ultimately solve the problem, right? Or mitigate it enough to where they can pull up, right, and not nosedive the plane. And so usually what most people will notice first themselves, from what I've seen and from what my clients have told me, is they'll notice this like physical tiredness, exhaustion. They may be getting sick more frequently, right? They'll notice sort of the physical symptoms first themselves, but and they'll also notice the cognitive ones. People will talk about like this brain fog, right? Or that they're kind of more irritable, and they can notice that. But what's interesting is the behavioral ones and the emotional ones, usually someone else picks up on those first typically. And those are things like they withdraw or they isolate, right? They sort of pull back from their friends, from family, and sometimes they start coping more, whether it's right self-medicating with alcohol, whether it's overeating, maybe over-exercising, right, can be a bad thing too. And then a lot of times it's that sort of emotional, they become like more cynical, and they can feel really detached from people around them. And then honestly, exactly like Cara said, it's like things they used to like, they don't enjoy anymore. And there's just this overall theme of like unhappiness, or this theme of like being ineffective. And so I usually tell people, yeah, there's a physical component, and then there's that emotional and that mental component.
So, I think it's worth probably jumping in just because you touched on a lot of it. If you're experiencing some of these symptoms that both of you articulated, just now, what are some initial steps that you can either self-diagnose or you would recommend that they go about getting treatment, meeting with somebody, those sorts of things. What are some things that you would recommend here at RPM? We have a vast array of different resources, both online and through app resources and through our HR department as well. But I think my sense is, and from listening to both of you speak and experiencing some of this in myself, I think the hardest part in all of it, and I sensed it from your story as well, is first and foremost the self-diagnosis of it and realizing you're actually experiencing some of it and you need some support or you need some assistance or help, whatever we want to call it. Cara, I'll start with you. What are some initial steps that individuals can take if they're listening and they're saying, listen, that's me and that's what I feel like right now? How should I go about finding some assistance or some help?
Burnout isn't just happen right now. It happens because we've been neglecting ourselves. I like to call it making a series of small self-betrayals, usually over decades, really neglecting the things that you probably knew you needed to be doing. And so the cool thing is you can get out by making a different set of decisions and choices, but it is going to be a bit of a journey. So step one is to recognize what it is. Two, to remove some of the stuff off our list. Because again, if you're this overburdened, overwhelmed, exhausted already, you don't need to add more stuff. Self-care. You don't need to be sold something. What you need to do is stop, take stock, and step one is making space. So we clear space in our homes, our minds, our all of the different areas of our lives. We get rid of what doesn't need to be there, learn boundaries, etc., before we even begin to start thinking about layering on new things.
How do you? It's such an amazing point of clearing space, but I think some folks may say like, well, how do I even start that? I mean, do you create a list of things that are taking space or that are obstructing the things you want to do? Any recommendations on how to identify what's taking space, either mental or emotional space?
It's such a good question because again, like I was just saying, and like you're kind of reiterating, you lack awareness because you're just too kind of
busy.
You're just fried, frankly. Your brain isn't working as clearly as it otherwise would be. And so it's very step by step. And the first step that I talk about in my book and then I work with clients on is actually making physical space. And the reason is that it's a very easy, tangible win to kind of stretch that little muscle. So I think we've all heard of Marie Kondo's book about the life-changing magic of tidying. And so I just have folks pick one little office, a closet. We're not going to go crazy and give ourselves 5 years of work here. And we're just going to do a little exercise in choosing what needs to be there. And she walks through it, but I kind of do like a mini version in my book where people can just, for the first time in a long time, actually be really thoughtful and intentional around what does need and doesn't need to be in there, what is in alignment with me right now. And it just starts to stretch that little muscle. And like she talks about in her book, and this is why she got so famous, because she's brilliant and it's true, it works. Like when you make space in your physical area, it does start to crack open some space in your actual brain. It's amazing how that works. So that's step one.
Yeah, no, that's real interesting. Bryan, I'd love to get your take here. For those, what are the first steps once they identify some of the things that we've talked about, even on this podcast? Let's say, for example, like I think the question is probably for a lot of high performers or middle performers, if you will, right? Sort of the range or the spectrum is what do I do and where do I go from here, or what's the first step that I take? And Cara, I think you outlined a really good, very functional, tangible one of creating physical space, which I think is incredible. Bryan, any thoughts on this here?
Yeah, I think the most important thing that she touched on, which is something that I do in my own life when I start to struggle again, or with clients who come to me for this issue, is to not add anything at first, right? That can be really overwhelming because a lot of people want to create new habits, right, and build on and add and grow. And the problem is that if you're in this state of burnout, it's likely because of an excessive workload, a lack of control, right? Value conflicts, some sort of breakdown in the community that you're in, right? So it's usually because of things that are already stacked on top of you. And so if your first inclination is to have someone, hey, start doing, handstands, cold plunges at 3 a.m. and drinking 4 gallons of kale juice, right? It's not going to work for most people,
Right.
because they don't want to do more. They want to do less.
Mhm.
And so you mentioned, is this something people could write down? And to piggyback off of what Cara was saying, I will a lot of times just have people take a pen and a sheet of paper and divide a sheet of paper in half and write down on one side of the sheet of paper things that are essential to them, right? Like absolutely essential. And then on the other side, things that, are non-essential or things that are negotiable. And literally just in writing, divide out things that they truly have to do and things that they don't have to do. And get clear on that. And then once they do that, for me, the next thing I try to do is to get them integrated back into a support system. For me, step number 2, after they identify it and sort of tease out what is too much, I really have to encourage them to get around other people, even if it's their dog, their cat. A lot of times people are isolating. And that's why, if you know anything about like AA or any of these recovery programs, the one thing that's always missing is people, right? And so for me, I try to encourage them to have some sort of an accountability partner, some sort of someone they can take, go on a walk with every day, but they need to be around other humans, or like I said, a pet or something. So for me, that's usually early on, is to remove physical things, but then to add relationship and community back.
Bryan, I think you really touch on such an incredible point with support system and people. I think oftentimes in today's digital society, we find ourselves very much isolated. There's actually some stats as I was sort of researching on the show is 69% of people feel more burnt out because of digital communication tools. No surprise to probably either one of you, but and it's really something I personally can work on in my own life, is disconnecting more frequently at certain hours of the day and things of that sort. Now you mentioned the support system and you mentioned get around people. I think there's a lot of discussion. I see it on social media. Distance yourself from certain types of people, those sorts of things. Is there any recommendations, as you're vetting these people in your life to create a support system? Because I think this is a nuance to that. There are people in our life, family specifically, but also friends, of course, that you need to be mindful of how you cultivate your circle. I'd love to get both of your thoughts on how you would recommend somebody build their circle out, because the reality is we don't get to pick family sometimes, and some of us are very blessed in situations, and sometimes it's not an ideal situation. Same with friends or even work colleagues or work environments. I'd love for you to kind of unpack that support system a little bit, and how you essentially qualify or vet the people around you that provide and encourage you in that support system. Bryan, I'll just bring it right back to you since you mentioned the support system, and then Cara, I'll get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think for me, it's we have some sticky situations in my family too, so I totally understand that.
I think we all do, yeah.
Yeah, of course. And I think what's really important is that I don't necessarily agree that we have to surround ourselves with like-minded people only. I think different-minded people can be really advantageous, right, and push us to grow.
Yeah.
But for me, I keep it really simple, and I tell people to think of people that they interact with or that they keep close like a fountain or like a drain, right? And so the way I think about it is, if I'm around someone and that person is not giving me energy or not giving me something that, with what I'm wanting to do in my life, is going to move me in the direction that I'm headed in a positive way, right? If they're not adding to my life, or they're not giving me energy or support, then I have to say I set a boundary. Because if they're draining, right, if they're taking away, right, if it's always about what can I get from you, not what can I get, what can I give, then I have to let it go. And the reason that is because, it's not to say that you can't help someone or that you can't make exceptions to the rule, but in general, everybody knows what it's like to be around someone that is just a constant drain, right? And if you're in this state where you feel overloaded, burnt out, foggy, you're down and out, the last thing you want is that misery loves company, right? Like, that's not a good place to be. And then if you have someone that's just pulling you down like an anchor, you have to cut that off and just let it go.
Mm. Yeah, easier said than done for sure, but wise words, I would definitely say. Cara, you have some thoughts. I saw you nodding there as well. What's your take here?
Yeah, well, I was loving the emphasis on managing our energy.
Hmm.
That's just an important tip of for life. But when you're burned out, you don't have any, and you don't have any to siphon off for anyone else. But what I would say, and I'll just give an example. So when I realized I needed to make a change, and I started to announce to folks like, okay, so I'm going to be making some shifts. I'm going to be taking a break from work. I'm going to be doing these things. I was able to suss out real quick who was on the team. And what I mean by that is some people were like, wow, man, what's going on? That you would need that. And how can I support you? And that's amazing. And just, the kinds of responses that suggested that the person was interested in my well-being and health and happiness, and was interested in listening and not just kind of putting their personal agenda, wants, needs, whatever on it. Conversely, there were people who would say things along the lines of, well, why would you do that? You'll have a gap in your resume. You'll never get hired again. You won't be taken seriously. How are you going to pay your bills? How are you going to help out with this? And just people who, and again, it's not because they're horrible people or something. It's mostly because they're just kind of projecting on you their own fears or insecurities or doubts or all of the things that are blocking them. And
Right.
so and maybe even a little jealousy, like they're thinking like, man, that sounds kind of cool. But so there's a lot of reasons why people do things. But just one big reminder for me that I think I had learned and had to double down on my learning was that the stuff people say and do just has not a lot to do with us, right? I just had to be like, okay, the people that were saying the kind of feedback that was really discouraging, I would just put it in my mental trash can and put them in kind of the outer circle. I didn't necessarily say I was never going to speak to them again, but I knew they didn't get inner circle access and they weren't going to be sharing the important parts of this journey with me versus the first group of people. I just knew that they were going to be on the team and that they were going to be there to offer support and that I would be there to offer it to them too, because we could help each other grow.
Well, I think the point that you make actually is very apropos, and to the point that you just made in the previous segment in space, creating space, and I think you're doing this with or the illustration that you just made now is with those who are to use sort of cross connections with Bryan's sort of drain analogy. You're making space to give yourself space from those folks that maybe drain you versus give you energy. I'd love to get both of your takes on, still kind of staying on the support system side, is how impactful is it, although you may feel you can't give, to still stay connected to the circle or the support system that we talked about, to breathe life or energy or positivity in other people's life during this time? Is that important as well? Is there some intrinsic effect that happens either sort of spiritually, medically, neurologically, that helps you yourself when you give back to others? I know it's sort of a bit of a deeper question, but I personally have found when I am in a situation kind of working through, if I can try to be positive for someone else, surprisingly, it actually makes me feel a bit better about myself.
Oh, yeah. I mean, for sure, just remembering that we're not alone. There is nothing we're doing that other people aren't probably doing something really similar about.
Done before, right?
And it is useful just to get out of our own little pity party head sometimes. Like, okay, fine, we're struggling. And there's a lot of other stuff. We actually do have a lot of to give, even if it's just a quiet listening ear, which is frankly a huge gift most people never get. So holding that space for people is a huge gift. And it's also just empowering to remember that, yes, we can give and we can receive. And frankly, once we get into the practice of actually taking care of ourselves, and to echo back the very first question, putting ourselves very high on our to-do list and actually doing our ingredients for well-being, whatever we do for fitness and health and fun and joy, doing the stuff, we'll find that we're refilling our cup. Can't pour from an empty cup, but you sure can from one that you're starting to actually fill, treating yourself with respect and feeling better. All of a sudden you're going to find like, oh man, I'm doing these things, but they're giving me energy, and now I have all this to share. And I think it does it builds. You're sharing with other people, they're sharing with you, and it becomes a greater than a sum of its parts thing.
Yeah, well said, Bryan. I'd love to get your take on this, giving back into people's lives as well. I know you do this on a daily basis on the LinkedIn platform as well, but probably personally and in real life and with your clients. But I think the question is that I posed to Cara is, when you feel that you're in the depths of this, just the physical activity of giving back or trying to inspire or motivate or give an encouraging word to somebody, is there something that's helpful with that?
Yeah, I think it's been said so many different ways by so many different people. I know one that always pops into my mind that I really sort of align with is Ed Milet. He talks about, when you're feeling helpless is to get helpful. And I think that it truly does translate. And then Dale Carnegie said something very similar for people who are really stuck in a fear and a worry type standpoint in their life, which can be a lot of times where you are in burnout. And that is to stop worrying and get out and get busy, right? And contribute to society or to other people in a positive, meaningful way. And what happens is there is definitely a feedback loop that happens when you see someone that's being poured into and loved on, and when someone is spreading gratitude, right? And you see that and the effects of that, then it really will lift you out of a lower place. And it's incredible how you may feel burned out, you may feel down, and you may not have this energy or this motivation. But even if it's something very small that you do for another person, it is incredible how that will sort of light the furnace again, right? Just that act of doing something for someone else. So it's so important, I think, to not lose sight of giving during a time where it really feels like you're reaching for the lifeboat. Just remember that sometimes it can be just as serving to spend a minute and to help.
Very well said. I'd like to kind of just pivot a little bit and talk about, especially with professionals, seasoned professionals like yourselves and others, and I see it in the corporate world. There's a lot of pride that really I think causes a tremendous barrier for help and progress and all the things. And I think that's what I think we're most excited about. I think as we go forward, and I think some things that the pandemic has taught a lot of us in the corporate world is it's okay not to be okay, right? And so we're very fortunate, here obviously at RPM that we have a lot of resources, and we embrace that culture as well. It's okay not to be okay, and our job, as a collective team here, as we work together, or friends or family, is to help you get to being okay, and then you can start making progress from there. Just the last question, Cara, I'll go back to you. Let's say you've made some progress now, you're feeling better, you've done those 30 days, right? 90 minutes before you went to bed, you're disconnecting, you're doing all those great things that Bryan said. You're waking up, you're not grabbing your cell phone immediately, you're doing some mindful work, maybe some stretching, some physical activity. You're starting to feel better after those 30 days, 45 days. Any suggestions now on how to sustain, this pace or this process, and how to maybe grow and build upon it, maybe in somewhat of a summary?
Yeah, it's a total lifestyle change to be in Bryan's choir. It's not a hack or two. It's not sleeping or waking up. It's not exercising or not, although those are all super important things. It is a whole shift. Like it's a systemic change in how you live your life, and that's why my book
almost
is
a value philosophical shift.
yes, and it's a shift back into yourself, into alignment with yourself. Who are you? What are you about? What matters to you? And so I talk about how it's a journey, a long journey sometimes, from self-neglect through self-care, all the way through to the magic of self-possession, which is a state of being in which we are so aligned with who we are and what we're about that making decisions as to how we spend our time, energy, and resources comes so much more naturally to us. We actually transformed ourselves. And in my book, it's a 10-week process that walks you through. There's exercises every week. You're handheld, but you do have to do it if you do want to do it. The good news is we have the power to make these shifts. Yes, the bad news is that we did get ourselves here. But in order to keep it, the last two chapters of my book are about sustaining. So we talk about joy and resilience as tools to sustain our gains. But really what we're doing is we're shifting our mindsets, habits, vision, actions, all of it, inside and out, for the better and for the long haul, so that we don't just take like some little eat, pray, love vacation and come back and we're still in our, pit of burning hell.
The fiery tornado of burnout, as we've described it. Remind everybody listening, Cara, the name of your book and where they could purchase it if they're interested.
Yep, it's called Burned Out to Lit Up, Ditch the Grind and Reclaim Your Life. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, everywhere really. If you want to listen, it's on Audible as well.
Very nice. Bryan, listen, you've made some improvements in your life. You've done the 90 minutes before sleep. You're waking up, feeling better, making good choices. How do you sustain it? How do you continue to create these processes in your life? And for some of the clients that I think you've probably worked with, that you're seeing great gains, maybe encourage somebody listening that, listen, it is doable. You're obviously a good example, Cara as well. But please share maybe sort of a positive story of outcomes once you make some life changes.
Yeah, I think it's first of all, I think the biggest thing or the main thing for people to realize is that once you do this process, it's a continual process, right? There's no real endpoint to any of this, and that's the important thing to realize, is that it's a continuation. And I think what's really, really cool is that what sustains this and what actually allows you to continue to do this is that all of these things that you're doing, which we can't go into all of these now, but all of these bad habits that you're removing, like Cara talked about, and all the new habits, right? And this rewiring and all of these new beliefs that you're creating, what you're really doing is you're creating these habits and these systems and these routines that are ultimately like a safety net, right? Of like this person that's walking on a high wire. Or when we were kids and we used to go bowling and they had those little bumpers so you couldn't throw gutter balls, right? What you're doing is you're putting up guardrails, or you're putting a safety net in place. And so then when life does come off the rails again, or something does go wrong, because it will, right? You're not like bulletproofing yourself like Iron Man, right? That's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is give you a system, give you a process, so that when things do go wrong, right, and you get knocked off course, then you have a way to self-correct, or you have a system or someone that you can reach out to. And so I really think that the sustainability to be able to do these things comes through the process of doing them anyways, because you become more self-aware, you become more self-aligned, and you realize that, and to Cara's point about journaling or writing things down, I can't emphasize enough how much that's truly changed my life, because what you do is when you go back and look at those things, you see patterns in your life, and you realize that when you're winning, these are the things I was doing. And when I was not doing well, these are the things that I was doing. And so there's so much that goes into all of this process, but really what you're doing is you're building a safety net, or you're putting up guardrails for your future self.
That's awesome. Very well said, Bryan. Where can people connect with you? Where can they learn more about your coaching opportunities?
Yeah, so if you want to learn more, follow along with me on LinkedIn, reach out, connect, jump on my profile, schedule a call. Happy to chat with any of you guys.
Awesome. I just want to say thank you to both of you for joining us today. It's been, first and foremost helpful to me, and hopefully there's a group of listeners that have really taken a lot of the tangible, feedback and tips and tactical, steps that you guys provided today. Really appreciate your time, and we're excited, and hopefully people reach out to you as well, which I trust that some will as well. So thanks again for your time, and I want to thank everybody who is listening. Thanks for joining us here on the podcast, Mic'd Up with RPM. I'm Tony Souza, the VP of Marketing Relations. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to Mic'd Up with RPM. Be sure to follow and subscribe to be notified of our future episodes.